2, 1.
Good morning from New York Climate Week and the UN General Assembly. I'm thrilled to welcome you all here to this fantastic panel during the World Economic Forum Sustainable Development Impact Meeting. I'm Jason Bordoff, a professor at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, where I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy. We're going to have a panel discussion today to focus on where we are in the global energy transition, whether it's amping up or powering down, what some of the headwinds and tailwinds are, particularly related to issues of policy, geopolitics, capital markets, technology developments. And we have a really fantastic panel to help us think through all of those issues. Sumant Sinha, who's the CEO and chair of Renew, one of India's largest renewable energy companies, a graduate of Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, and a good friend, Dr. Rebecca Boudreau, who's the president and CEO of Oberon Fuels, an innovative company producing low and carbon negative fuels like hydrogen and methanol from organic waste like food waste and agriculture waste. And then my friend David Victor, who is one of the best minds I know of when it comes to all things energy and climate, a distinguished professor of innovation and public policy at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego, really working at that intersection of climate science, technology, and policy. So welcome to you all. Thanks for being here for this conversation. One additional piece of housekeeping, if you're sharing takeaways from the panel on social media, please use the hashtag SDIM25. So normally I don't favor the sort of just general open-ended starter question, but I do think it is interesting to think about this moment in time that we're in, what the sort of zeitgeist this week feels like, the sense that the energy transition is troubled. There are policy and geopolitical challenges, tensions more globally, obviously a very different administration here in the United States. I'm wondering, David, if you could just start us off by sort of sharing your thoughts on where we are, what you are focused on this week, what we should all be focused on this week as we come together for this set of conversations about energy security, about climate and the transition, and about the global economy.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Well, clearly a lot of people this week are focused on the question of how do we cooperate, how do we get things done with the United States having a different agenda, chaos in the United States. And that's not just the recent election, that's been around for quite a long time. And I think the energy transition discussions put all that in a crucible. People have been saying that with the Trump administration and the rollback of the credits, a bunch of tax incentives and so on, that the energy transition is dead or dying. I think news, to paraphrase Mark Twain, news of the death of the energy transition is exaggerated. In fact, the fundamentals in a lot of places are doing very well. The data suggests that we're going to see a drop in a lot of U.S. deployment, and then it's just going to continue growing. And meanwhile, in the rest of the world, it continues apace. In Europe, and then also in China. The picture in China is just extraordinary, and it's been very important to recognize that this is these are global technologies, and to the extent that they're able to be traded globally, that's been very good news overall for the energy transition. Clearly, we have headwinds against unfettered globalization. So I think the overall picture is actually still pretty encouraging. I like one last thing I'll say about this, which is I like to make a distinction between the kind of easy energy transition stuff. So think about, especially on the electric power side, deployment of renewables, keeping nuclear plants open, running hydro plants efficiently. They're important in many countries, Brazil and others, Norway. You've got that's working, and it's mainly in the power sector, and the power sector globally is making the most progress on the energy transition. Then you have this hard stuff. Clean molecules, fuels, sustainable aviation fuel, or synthetic aviation fuel, as now some people call it. You have clean diesel, variety of other replacements for natural gas, ways of burning natural gas and using it for generating power while capturing the carbon. We know a lot about the technology. Some of the technologies are very expensive. The business models are still not panning out. And yet, we see things happening even in that space. So the easy energy transition is continuing to attract a huge amount of capital, year in year, massive growth. Hard energy transition, not dead, still hard.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up, and then I'll come to Rebecca, just staying on the U.S. for a minute, because you talked about the significant change, obviously, in policy we've seen, and you're familiar with all the analyses, our friends at the Rhodium Group and elsewhere, a significant change in the outlook for carbon emission reductions in the next decade and beyond. And the idea that the Inflation Reduction Act was the most important historic piece of climate legislation ever, and then what you just said, which is significant parts of it have been pulled back, but don't worry, we'll see a small dip, but then in the long run, not much change. How should someone reconcile what seem like two dissonant notes?
Yeah, I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act was a big deal, there's no question about it. The rollback of it and the cancellation of projects, that in some sense the cancellation of summarily canceling projects without warning has been maybe even a bigger deal.
That's more about permitting than it is
permitting,
yeah.
But it creates political risk in the United States market, where the United States market used to not have that much political risk. That's a really, really big deal. So I don't want to be Pollyannish about this. The U.S. picture has a lot of clouds around it, but nonetheless, the fundamentals are pretty powerful. And this is ultimately a global market and a global technology. So that's why I'm encouraged. And unusual things happen. Here we are, a panel of 4 people. 2 of us are from San Diego. Who would have thought in a panel on global energy technology that half of it would be from San Diego?
I thought you were from Louisiana.
Originally. I live in San Diego.
I know.
Citizen of the U.S. and the world. I live globally.
So, Rebecca, I'd love your kind of following on what David said. You're trying to put a lot of capital to work in a lot of clean energy solutions in a pretty dynamic, uncertain policy environment. More of a conversation we're having about risks to the global economy, about the economic outlook, about tensions around the world. Tell me what you're focused on this week and what we should all be paying attention to.
Yes, I think about this week. It's interesting in this challenging time. Innovation always has headwinds. For the last 20 years, I've been focused on commercializing technologies and helping companies scale. I'm trained as a PhD chemist. I started off with, the best technology wins, which we all know that is not the case. It's just one piece of the puzzle. And so I think about this week, it's about, yes, there are challenges, but it's always about continuous innovation. But it's not just on the technology. Yes, there's better ways to do things. There's cheaper ways. We can drive down cost, carbon intensity. But it's also about innovation in the markets, in financing and how we structure these deals. It's about regulations. And that's the journey that we've been living at Oberon Fuels for the past 15 years. When we started, there were no regulations in place to actually even legally sell the renewable molecule, dimethyl ether, DME, that we were going to sell in the state of California. So we had to work with the state of California to change the code of regulations. We did that in 2015. We had to change the taxation laws because the laws aren't written for innovation. We did that in 2020 when Governor Newsom signed legislation. So it's all those other pieces that we often don't think about. And this is just a continuation. Yes, things are challenging, but innovation will happen, not just on technology, but on regulations, markets, financial instruments, and all the other pieces that have to come together.
Sumant, welcome. You lead a company that's done an enormous amount to try to advance clean energy, renewable solutions, solar in particular, wind. The conversation happening in New York this week, and it's just getting underway, but I'm sure already, tell me if I'm wrong, you've heard about energy security, energy affordability being sort of front and center areas of focus in addition to maybe even superseding discussions of climate and the energy transition. I'm wondering how that looks from where you sit in India, how India navigates those things. The focus on security and affordability is not new for a rapidly growing emerging market like India. Do you feel a shift and a tension, and is that creating more challenges?
Fortunately, Jason, not for us. I think while, of course, we're in the US and there's so much going on here with respect to being for renewables, not being for renewables, being for the energy transition, and so on. In the rest of the world, I think there's nothing, nothing dramatic has changed. The environment continues to be as supportive as it was earlier, most countries are continuing on their trajectories that they had followed. NDCs, as you know, are still being revised and submitted, and COP30 in Brazil that is coming up is going to be a very important, I think, marker in how the rest of the world is dealing with this whole situation around climate change and energy transition. What I'm hearing now in the US is more to do with job creation, energy security, and affordability, which is always the other part of the coin, which was climate change was the other part, right? So I think it doesn't matter what you focus on as long as you get to the same end objective, which is the energy transition, because ultimately the energy accounts for 75% of all carbon emissions. So as long as the clean energy transition continues apace, it's fine. Whether that happens because of climate change, whether that happens because of affordability or security, I think eventually we're going to get to the same end outcome. And so for me, there isn't that much of a change that I see. Maybe the narrative has changed a little bit here, but in the rest of the world, really things are carrying on as they were earlier. If anything, I see ambition being scaled up because the issue of affordability has become even stronger. And the issue of energy security in these, in these volatile geopolitical times has become even stronger. And so those are actually driving the energy transition, if anything, in other parts of the world, even faster.
The idea that moving faster to, just to clarify what you're saying, tell me if I'm capturing it right, reduce exposure to global markets, reduce trade in energy, most of which is fossil fuels. The focus on energy security, you view that as an accelerant for interest in clean energy?
I do see, take the case of a country like India, which is a net massive energy importer. We import almost $200 billion worth of fossil fuels every year. With trade being sort of whipsawed around right now, being dependent on external trade is not the best thing in the world. And so to the extent that you can actually have a lot of the energy development happening within the country, and if you can also make the equipment that supports that also within the country, so much the better. So I think it's actually leading policymakers to think a little bit more deeply about how dependent you want to be on core energy needs on the rest of the world. And given that renewable energy all operates within your borders and so on, that's a clear solution or a clear alternative path. And so therefore, it is becoming an accelerant, especially given what's happening globally right now.
As David, you said a moment ago not to be Pollyannish, so I'm curious, when you see that increased focus on energy security and cost, is that also sort of friend or foe to a faster transition?
I mean, in some ways it can be friend. I do think there's a tension here, which is you see a growing number of governments, partly because they're concerned about energy security, partly because they're looking at the ambiguity and chaos in trading rules, and they don't know what to expect. And so there's a very strong pressure to onshore. And we've seen that tremendous onshoring in India. There's an onshoring going on in the United States, a lot of other places and so on. I am concerned that onshoring has created, especially in high-cost production areas like the United States, has created chaos and higher costs. And for literally decades, the clean energy transition, the parts of it that were working really well, think about solar, think about batteries to some degree, nuclear technology, they thrived because they were global technologies. And now we're in a world where we're moving from innovations being able to command a global marketplace and very quickly see very large market shares, come down learning curves quickly, to something where you've got that going on with IP, but at the same time you've got chaos in supply chains. And that in some places, including the United States, has driven up costs.
I want to come back to that because this conversation about how to think about national security, economic security, energy security in the context of these global energy supply chains, not just the daily flow of energy. And often people, talk about solar panels, batteries, critical minerals. I'm wondering, Rebecca, for clean fuels,
right,
how do you see this kind of area, increased focus, increased world of economic fragmentation, geopolitical competition? How does that affect what you're doing in clean fuels?
Well, clean fuels are absolutely essential to energy security. And when you think of energy security, you're thinking mainly about leveraging your natural resources. And I think as we think about the energy transition, we have broadened what we think about as natural resources. We used to think, okay, if you can pull it out of the ground, right, that's your natural resource, we can control our energy supply. But technology has allowed us to do better ways of using the sun, the wind. Every country that has a human population has a large amount of waste, whether it's human, animal, agricultural, all of these things. And so that's what, as we think about energy security, technology's enabled us to better use all of these things that we have within our countries. So I think it spurs clean fuels. It enables people to be more innovative. It enables technology to be deployed maybe at a smaller scale initially, but then it can be scaled up further in a global market. So I think clean fuels and energy security go hand in hand.
Sumant, when you, responding to what David and Rebecca just said, when you think about, David's point in particular, the focus on energy security and the global supply chains that emerge from it, there's significant concern with the exposure to supply chains that are heavily dominated by China. And I'm wondering how you see that kind of panning out. How much does that present? The other point David made was the focus on energy security leads people to want to do things within their own borders and not be dependent on imports, including of manufactured products like a battery or a solar panel, which could potentially be quite inflationary for energy costs if everybody tries to manufacture within their own borders what they deploy for energy. Is that a risk that you see?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And it's a pretty complex topic. I think countries that have a lot of fossil fuels, for them, energy security means consuming more fossil fuels. It's not going after necessarily more renewable energy, right? And so that's really the path that the US has taken, for example. And that's fine. But other countries which are not fossil fuel rich have to take a different path. Now, I agree with you that most of the supply chain of the clean energy transition is currently sitting in China. And China has brought costs down to such a level that it's been fabulous in terms of being able to get it, increase the affordability and so on. Now I think it's a question also of, especially for some of the other larger countries, do we want to keep being dependent on China for all of our imports? And in some cases, the answer is no. I mean, some countries are saying that we don't want to be dependent on China. And so that means we have to develop our own parallel supply chain. And that is inflationary, of course, compared to what you might get out of China. But I think you have to weigh the inflationary aspect of it against the security aspect of it. And I think, at least in the case of India, we're taking the view that we want to diversify our supply chain away from China. Now, countries, some countries or most countries are not taking that view right now. So I think let's see what happens. It's an evolving scenario. China clearly is the 800-pound gorilla. They have massive capacities. They have very low costs. For any other country to compete with that is going to be well nigh impossible. India has a large enough domestic market that we can set up a domestic industry. Whether we become competitive with China, hard to say. It'll take several years. And whether, therefore, we become an alternative to China from a supply chain standpoint, we'll have to wait and see. But certainly the effort is in that direction.
David, I'm curious. I'll pose a question, so you might want to respond to Sumant. But that comment he made about what energy security means to different countries and what it means for a major oil and gas producer in the context of U.S. policy. We're the largest oil and gas producer in the world. We're a massive exporter of both oil and gas. It's easy to see why some people watching may have respond to what you said earlier, which is to be bullish on the pace of the transition and say, wait a minute, we get energy security from consuming as much oil and gas as possible and producing it. Why are we moving to these technologies that expose us to these security risks of a supply chain dominated by many other countries, again, particularly China? How should we think about energy security in that context?
I think energy security is like a Rorschach test. In this case, everybody wants energy security, but people see something different in the ink blot. Some people see a dragon, some people see a butterfly, a variety of other shapes and so on. And without psychoanalyzing folks too much, I think for a lot of folks, energy security has been equated with autarky, being able to do it all at home. That's simply false. Look at the products market already, oil and gas, oil products in particular. For the most part, security has gone up when we've had more diversity in supply and demand and more flexibility. And people forget that one of the first times, maybe the first time, the International Energy Agency coordination agreements were used was when the U.S. had a supply problem from Gulf of Mexico production and refineries that were shut down during a hurricane. So we relied on imports to create more security. I think exactly the same thing is going to happen with the clean energy transition. It's a different kind of imports. It's critical minerals and materials, and it's intellectual property and so on. The solution, we are overly dependent on one country. Security comes from diversity and diversity alone. And so we need to have a more diverse set of supplies. But that's not the same thing as making sure we make all of our lithium here and all of our rare earths and so on. I'm really concerned that the kind of thread industry looks at critical minerals and they say we have to onshore all this stuff, whereas that's completely the wrong lesson from the history of commodity markets. The right lesson is we have to have diversity and flexibility in market arrangements so that then these markets, most of which are pretty thin markets to begin with, thin commodity markets other than copper, those markets can then function more effectively. We will get security from that. How do you describe that to policymakers and publics who are not that interested in the 5-minute answer? That's a challenge, but there's a big risk of us really blowing this one.
Well, and who've heard talk of energy independence for at least a half a century, since the 1970s oil crises, and you're describing a world where interdependence actually bolsters security.
Exactly. Interdependence and markets.
And let me say that I'm not necessarily disagreeing with what David is saying. I actually agree with him.
You can disagree wholeheartedly.
No, but actually in this case, I do agree with you that diversification can also bring security. Today, the problem is, in practical terms, the entire world depends on one other country. for energy, for clean energy supplies. And so therefore, you actually have to work really hard to diversify that supply base. And that's not really happening if you look at any country's trade policies. It's really not being built into their mechanisms right now. And so therefore, I guess for certain countries, you have the option of either being dependent on that one country for the foreseeable future, or continue to have onshoring your fossil fuels. And it's not the right answer, but that's really the view that a lot of people are taking.
This is the big risk in deglobalization, is that one of the main strategies we've used, which is to have somewhat open global markets, that strategy becomes, I think, harder to sustain. I do think that it's easy to forget there's a really big difference between import dependence for critical minerals that are materials that are associated with the clean energy transition, and import dependence or supply dependence for oil. The entire global economy needs 100 million barrels per day, every day, and if we get a million barrels per day hiccup, chaos breaks out. That just is not the case for the critical materials associated with the clean energy transition.
Because they're inputs to
they're inputs, they're used once, so yes, there are risks to supply chains and things like that, but it's radically harder to corner a market for a sustained period of time. The Chinese have learned this multiple times, the Japanese have learned this. It's harder to corner a market like that when you have a commodity that's used once in production than when you have a flow commodity like oil.
And I think this is really played out in the book, a fantastic book, Turning Oil into Salt. And it gives the example, historically, wars were fought over salt. And until there came the advent of refrigeration. It's not that the world doesn't use salt anymore. We actually use more. But because of the technology, now there wasn't such a stronghold. And it's the same thing with oil. It's not that we're getting off of oil. It's about that, again, the diversification and having other options and breaking the stronghold of oil by having more options.
Rebecca, we also heard David and Sumant sort of, again, say Winston Churchill's famous, admonition, security in oil lies in variety, and variety alone is as true in clean energy supply chains. And that may not mean autarky, do everything within your own borders, but it does mean we got to build a lot of other stuff in a lot of other places, in other countries, and diversify supply chains and advanced economies using what tools they have to think about de-risking investment in maybe emerging market countries to diversify these supply chains. I'm wondering, when you look at what's happening in capital markets today, in the global economy, and in the permitting landscape, it's really hard to go build new projects. How possible is it going to be, and how costly will it be to achieve the kind of diversification they were just talking about?
Yeah, so it's interesting as we think about, how we're going to do this. How do we put all the pieces of the puzzle together? As I said earlier, technology is just one part of it, and sometimes it's the easiest part, right? Technology and science follow the laws of gravity, thermodynamics. There's certain principles they follow. When it comes to regulations, regulatory environments, there are in many ways no laws, right, that guide what can and cannot be done. And so as we think about what is going to, how do we get these other pieces of regulations, the financing for it? And it's really about finding the right partners across the supply chain that can look at not just, we're going to make this molecule for this market, but taking what we've learned from the oil industry. There's a barrel of oil, and there's cuts used for different things, different markets. They have different values. And it's the same thing as we think about building projects. And that's how at Oberon, we've been thinking about building projects. Okay, we have a waste stream. There's a feedstock. Where is it located? What is its volume? What is its carbon intensity? What is the right molecule to make? And what markets can create the highest value with this waste? And that's really the way of the oil refinery and the barrel of oil. There's different cuts going to different markets. And so that's what we can enable when we come back to how are we going to finance this, right? You need long-term stable revenue streams for the infrastructure funds and project financing to fund it, these new facilities. And so what's important is how using this approach of building different revenue streams, getting more certainty in the markets who will take a long-term position, and finding the right partners who can do that.
Sumant, I'm curious, you're operating in a lot of places, the US, India. The challenge, there's nothing new about policy uncertainty. Business leaders like you have to navigate that. It does seem like it's going up. It does seem like the pendulum is swinging more sharply in both directions, not just in the US, but elsewhere. I'm curious how you navigate that, and maybe what lessons one should take from experiences elsewhere where you've been able to deploy really quickly and at scale, like in India.
Yeah, look, I think first of all, as a business leader, you need to have your ear to the ground. That's very clear, even more so than at most of the times. There's so much change happening almost on a daily basis. Some days there are tariffs, some days there aren't, some days they're going up, some days they're going down. So you have to be really, really nimble about understanding what's happening. I think that's step one. The second thing I think is that as a business leader, you also have to have an organization that can move relatively fast. And you have to really build agility into your business processes, your systems, your reaction to all the new developments that are happening. And I think you have to find pockets of policy certainty where you can actually operate and make investments for the longer run. I think the worst thing for business leaders is policy uncertainty. And so therefore, wherever you see policy uncertainty, it's hard to make long-term investment decisions. And so therefore, you find areas where, in fact, that policy certainty exists and then sort of double down on those areas. For example, even though we operate mostly in India, and there's a lot of policy certainty around the whole area of the electricity, the clean energy transition on electricity, but there isn't that much on the green fuels part, right? So a few years ago, there's a lot of hype around green hydrogen and green ammonia and so on, and we all started developing a lot of projects to start producing green hydrogen and green ammonia, especially with the view to selling into the international markets in Europe, in the Far East, and so on. But what we find is that given all the stuff that is happening, a lot of those countries are now pulling back because they have many other demands on their budget and on their fiscal deficits. And so, whether it's defense, whether it's their own volatility where they're operating. And so the desire of these countries to go for green hydrogen or green ammonia has definitely not manifested itself. So a lot of the projects that we've developed, we've just had to put on hold because now we don't have markets for them. But meanwhile, the Indian market is developed. And so therefore, the question is, how can we now take advantage of that market? So I think you just have to be a little bit agile in how you think about it and also keep sort of working on finding out what's happening globally in different markets.
David, your optimism about the outlook for renewables, was that primarily about the power sector? Or when you look at clean fuels, green hydrogen, as Sumant said, it seems like a lot of people want to make green hydrogen. It's not as clear lots of people want to buy it because it's expensive. And the kind of government support you need when advanced economies are at World War II debt levels and Europe's ramping up defense spending. What's your outlook there?
Yeah, I think Sumant's lessons for business leaders are true for analysts. And so as an analyst, you've got to have your ear to the ground, you've got to be nimble. What I see happening is there are now a variety of different models emerging for the for clean energy investments. There's stuff that's in the money already, and that's happening and will continue to happen. Keeping nuclear plants open, reopening older ones, solar and wind, these easy projects, all that's happening, storage. Then there's this question of these harder things to do. There's an American model that's emerging because of the chaos at the federal level. It's doesn't mean the clean energy revolution stopped here. It means that it's private actors who, in one way or another, are trying to do projects, and they're doing it on their own balance sheets. We see this in the data centers in particular. The data center play is incredible, and it's not that people are willing to spend unlimited amount of money for clean energy projects, but they've been willing to have PPAs that are roughly double the normal costs. So that's impressive. You've got a European model, kind of regulated model that's very interesting. That's where basically governments are providing coordination and regulation. Then you've got a Chinese model, which is a state-owned, state-led model. And so you've got these different kinds of models that in different ways are emerging. I think the comment you made about, and Sumant made about hydrogen is to me very interesting. Most of the good news is on the electron side. It's on clean electricity, it's on electric vehicles, it's on storage, it's on things like that. That's fantastic. The molecule side is much more complicated. I do think we've got a bit of I'll call it a hydrogen hangover. People got obsessed about hydrogen, they were excited about hydrogen. A lot of folks went all in on hydrogen. They in particular went all in on green hydrogen on the expectation the costs were going to come down. They didn't. I think the whole industry and the policymakers made a big strategic error in becoming overly obsessed on green hydrogen and not on the whole rainbow, if you like, including blue hydrogen. But be that as it may, a lot of the hangover in the molecule space and in the fuel space is hydrogen related. And when you look beyond that, you see projects like what you're doing and a handful of others. Not massive scale yet, but those are the seeds of real projects that are going to be commercially viable.
Does that ring true to you, Rebecca?
Absolutely.
This is what you're doing.
This is what we're doing, and we see, there's the world of molecules. As trained as a chemist, obviously I love molecules, but I like electrons too, and you're seeing them merging in a continuous creativity and how these worlds are merging, you see, with e-fuels. But as we look at a feedstock and we look at waste in a certain area, in cases there's an abundance of solar and wind, well, gee, we can generate our own electricity in that region, drive down the carbon intensity of our molecules, and all of these things are working together. And that's, again, playing to what resources are available, how do we do this, how can we do it better, and not just be beholden to one molecule, one way to get to electron, but looking at the big picture of just leveraging what we have to do more faster.
We talked, I'm going to come back a little bit to sort of what we were talking about a moment ago, which is this new world of geopolitical tension and competition and what impact that has on how to think about the pace of the energy transition. And Suman, I'm just interested in your perspective because there's a lot of discussion for a while about great power rivalry, tensions between the US and China. Increasingly, tensions in the US-India relationship, which has been a very important one and a very close one. And in that world of US-China competition, very significant emerging market countries like India potentially get caught in the middle. And I'm wondering what impact, how you see that playing out and what impact it has for when you look at the outlook for government policy support, energy trade flows, the choices India makes about what energy sources it wants to prioritize. Again, is this a headwind or a tailwind for deploying clean energy faster?
So, I think that India and the US have been very close and have been getting closer over the last several years, and I think that will continue, notwithstanding the temporary, change that has happened on the tariff structure and so on. I think there's already a rapprochement that is beginning to happen. So I'm less worried about that. I think the issue really is that what all of this is making the Indian policymakers realize is that we need to be a little bit more self-dependent and self-reliant. And this is, the Prime Minister had coined a term called, in Hindi, Atmanirbhar Bharat, which essentially meant a self-reliant India. And that doesn't mean that you make everything within your own borders, but it just means that you have a very strong economy as far as possible. Because I think today everybody realizes that power comes from economic strength. And so therefore, the faster you can grow, I think the more strength it gives you as an economy and as a country. And I think that's the direction that India is moving in. We are already now the fourth largest economy in the world. Probably in the next couple of years, we'll become the third largest economy. We're growing at about 6 or 7% every year in real terms. And give us another 20, 30 years, and we'll be where China is today. And so pretty sizable as an economy. So I think that's the direction that we're going in. And the other thing is that we're also, there's a thought about how we can make the domestic economy a lot more efficient. And so, for example, the Prime Minister recently announced a massive reform in the goods and services tax, where they've actually been brought down, put more money in the hands of consumers, and try to really kickstart the economy and sort of make the growth go faster. And so the whole idea is how can you become a little bit more focused on your internal developments and economic growth rather than being reliant on the external world. So I think that's really the messaging that I would say a lot of countries are coming to. In this environment, that's the best recipe for staying sane and staying, continue to grow and doing the best for your people.
David?
I agree 100% with that, and that's what every country should be doing. I'm going to put a sharper edge on this, though. I think the current administration is radically mishandling the US-India relationship. We have invested so much and for so long in being a more reliable partner with India. It's of a tremendous strategic importance across the board on a range of topics, especially in a world where we become concerned about too much dependence on China and a rising China, and we're trying to diversify the relationships. And so, yes, the rapprochement may be in the works, but the message is undeniable, which is that the United States is not reliable, and that message, I think, will take a generation at least to undo. So I'm very, very concerned about the current direction there. And the relationship with India is important on many, many fronts, on the advancement of nuclear power in ways that don't become as dependent upon Russian exports. India is going to be incredibly important, and they're incredibly important on the rest of the clean energy revolution, including in solar. So I think this has been a seriously harmful wrong turn.
I'm not sure if moderators are allowed to make editorial comments, but I share the concern. And it ties back to what you all agreed earlier, which is security in part comes from diversification of global supply chains. And that's a priority on both sides of the aisle here in the United States. And if you're going to try to diversify supply chains, you want to work with major players around the world in which energy and clean energy manufacturing can be ramped up much more quickly. David, I'm curious what, we're all coming together in New York City, September, but in November, we'll, another very important, massive economy, emerging market, very important in the energy world in multiple ways. Oil and gas, clean energy is hosting the COP, Brazil. And what do, some countries are weakening their NDCs. The US may not submit one at all. What are you expecting from COP30, and is it an important event or not?
It's an important event because it happens every year, and if you didn't have it happen, then everyone would notice that it didn't happen. And if you had it happen and it didn't reach agreement, then everyone would notice that you didn't reach agreement, and then the credibility of the mechanism of the whole umbrella would be harmed. So in that sense, it's very important. I'm impressed by the Brazilian hosts. Incredibly skilled diplomatic team. If anybody can pull this off and get an agreement where agreement's not possible, which is, I think, the job of a diplomat, then it's the Brazilians can do this. I'm very concerned that the agenda in climate cooperation is becoming increasingly difficult. The topics they're talking about, large transfers of money, so-called loss and damage, ratcheting up the ambition of these nationally determined contributions, these NDCs, when most countries aren't meeting their NDCs already, and they should be thinking about how do we blink, how do we back off unreachable goals and talk about more realistic goals. That ought to be the real conversation, but politically that's a hard conversation. So the list of things that are hard to impossible to do at these climate conferences is getting longer. And one of these days we're going to have a climate conference that'll be like the one in 2009 in Copenhagen that just ends in diplomatic failure. In Copenhagen's case, that was a blessing because it opened the space for new ideas, and ultimately that was the Paris Agreement. I'm very enthusiastic about the Paris Agreement. This time it will be very harmful, and so I think there's a risk that we'll have one of these climate conferences, maybe even Brazil or beyond, that ends in failure, and we need countries that are motivated to say the right things in terms of, well, this is where we're headed. This is why the process is not dead. This is why this is useful, and so on. The U.S. will not be that country, and frankly, if the U.S. doesn't go, I think that actually would be a good thing, because the last thing in the world you want when you need consensus decision making is a large country that's sitting in there that doesn't want to offer consensus. For years, China did that. Sometimes Russia did that. The Saudis did that. The United States is poised to do that. So frankly, if you're not going to come and be constructive, don't come at all.
Could you very quickly, because I don't want to get off on a tangent, but given that few countries are on track to meet the commitments they made in Paris, and emissions have gone up almost every year since, other than a global pandemic, just say another sentence or two about your optimism about the Paris process? Well,
there are a lot of things that have been going on, not just Paris. 15 years ago, the world was on track for maybe 5 degrees of warming. Now we're on track for maybe 2.5 or 3 degrees of warming. A lot of things happen there. Macroeconomic slowdown in some countries, but some of it's technological change, some of it's policy. So overall, it's still a lot of climate change. We're in for a lot of climate change. It's a significant problem, but that's where we're making progress. Here's where I think the goals that we've set have created this impression of failure because we're not meeting the 1.5 and we're not meeting all these companies with net zero pledges. They've got no idea how to do this in most cases. And yet they're doing real things. And so you're going to have a whole bunch of governments and companies soon-ish, it's already started in a few companies, that have to walk back. A year ago, I published with Joisa Dutra a paper for the World Economic Forum called How to Blink Responsibly. How do you walk back from a target that's not achievable and yet show, here are the real things that I'm doing, here's what else needs to happen? You're going to see a lot of companies and governments that are grappling with that, and not because they're unserious, but precisely because they are serious.
How do you view convenings, big international conferences and negotiations like COP, Rebecca, the outcomes, the commitments to finance, the commitments to targets, as we've heard, not necessarily being met, but maybe stretch targets pushing the envelope more than would otherwise be the case. How do they affect what you're doing and the potential for success in a business like Oberon's?
Yeah, so while we started in the U.S., we've always had a global focus. We were the first producer of renewable DME in the U.S. and the only currently commercially, and we've been sending product to countries all over the world as they see the market for another way to help meet their target for cleaner fuels and cleaner chemicals. And so we watch what's going on at the global level, and when appropriate, participate in showing, yes, all of these things are changing, but just set the rules and we can adapt. right? When, the IRA, there were rules, it changed, we had one big, beautiful bill. Okay, so now we know what we're doing, and now we can innovate and meet those goals, right? And meet those targets. And so for us, while we focus on our projects deploying, doing more, doing it faster, leveraging existing infrastructure, we're always watching, and that's why we've taken this approach of when we have a feedstock, know its carbon intensity, know its volume, what is the right molecule to make, and what are the right markets. And those right markets are being determined on the policy front. Who are the leaders, whether it's countries, sectors, organizations, and that's where we will deploy, and those molecules will ultimately go.
We've kind of touched on so many different things and covered such a broad range of both reasons for optimism, but also challenges to how quickly the energy transition is accelerating, and how we simultaneously bolster energy security, affordability, provide more energy to rapidly growing economies in the global south. And those challenges range from lack of finance, permitting issues, the lack of policy durability. As you said, there was a lot of excitement about green hydrogen, but the money's not there for it, and so that makes it harder to compete economically. I'm just kind of curious to hear from each of you, what one should prioritize if you were a policymaker for a day, like what things you think right now to achieve all of those objectives that we're now thinking even more, at least in certain parts of the world, about issues like affordability and security as well as the transition. What would move the needle the most? What matters the most? And it's probably different in different parts of the world for sure.
Well, that's a tough question. But if I can just react to the COP30 question that you asked, my sense is that right now, and I'm going to be a little bit optimistic in this answer, there is already so much happening on the energy transition that I think there's a lot of momentum that has been built up. And I think that we need less policy support now than we needed earlier as an industry as a whole. We still, of course, need some, but I think that amount is coming down. And I think at some point in the near future, we'll be at a point where commercial elements are just going to take over the whole energy transition. We are perhaps 5 or 7 or 10 years away from that. But I think at that point, it won't really matter what policymakers even make of policies in their respective countries, because the corporate sector, the commercial markets, everything is going to be pushing in that direction. And so to answer your question and coming back to that, I think as a policymaker, I think the most important thing is to give certainty to people. Have a roadmap developed for the next 5 or 10 years at the very least as to what that country is going to do, in terms of the clean energy transition, on supply chains, on some of the critical minerals and those kinds of things. Make that roadmap and make it very clear to everybody in the corporate sector, this is what we're going to do. And then don't change it, because once you have a plan that is there and there's certainty around it, that's really when the corporate sector is at its best in terms of making things happen.
David, if we want to just put a finer point on it, if we want to meet rising power demand for AI, bring energy costs down, diversify energy supplies, which we've talked about already, we need companies like Suman's and Rebecca's to succeed. What should we be focused on that's going to move the needle the most?
Two things. First, we need to keep doing more projects. Some of the projects are already in the money. They're happening. It's going to happen. That's especially true on the bulk electric power side. On the molecule side, not yet. So we need more projects so they become more normal, and frankly, they become boring. But boring means they become financeable with normal financial instruments. Everything that's interesting in deep decarbonization is capital intensive. And so capital intensity is the real barrier here, and that requires, that's one thing we have to do. The other thing we have to do on the political side in this country is we have to talk to more Republicans about the multiple benefits of clean energy transitions and energy security. One of my mentors at Stanford was George Shultz, center-right Republican. We need more Schultzian voices. He's now sadly passed away, but Schultzian voices that see this as part of a bigger tent politically in the country. Otherwise, this is going to be seen as a mission of the left, and that means it'll be politically fragile.
Does that resonate?
Yes, and what resonates with me is as I think about this energy transition, what do we need? What if I was a regulator for a day, what would I do? Set the target, right? This is the carbon intensity that we want to hit. This is the volume that we need. This is the deadline. Don't tell us how to get there. Don't tell us what molecules to make, what technology to use, what type of way we're going to generate our electrons. Just set the target. and let the innovators and the technologists, the people who know how to do it, the supply chain develop and figure out the solution. But just set it. Don't try to pick the winners. Just set the targets and let us go after it.
All right, we are at time. This was a fascinating discussion, and we identified a number of the challenges on the landscape, a world of more economic fragmentation, geopolitical competition, potential for conflict. There's a lot of reasons to be concerned, so I appreciate that that you all brought optimism to this conversation as well for what the outlook is. But a lot of work that needs to be done, I think, on how to mobilize capital, on policy durability, on permitting, how to build infrastructure, and how to build more of a big tent and some agreement across diverse viewpoints, politically and otherwise, that if you're trying to think about meeting energy needs, energy costs, energy affordability, energy security, and the environment, you know, we actually can find common ground and find common purpose in a lot of this stuff. So really value all of your insights, and want to thank you all for joining us today for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.